So yeah, they worked on that brochure. They did 2 editions of the brochure with the Phoenix Society. And then in the 70s, they sponsored this drag queen who will go out in the community and do BD testing. She dressed as a nurse, and she had a van, and she went by Wanda Lust, and she would park like at Liberty Memorial and outside bars and give free BD testing.
And this was back in like
this is the 70s.
70s. Wow.
Yeah.
What was her name?
Wanda Lust.
Wanda Lust. I love that. Dressed as a nurse.
Dressed as a nurse, yes. And all paid for by the city.
I wouldn't think that it was taking place that early on. Like I would imagine, definitely after the HIV/AIDS epidemic.
Right.
Like I could definitely see them being involved at some point during that process, but not before.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting.
So knowing where to go and find these individuals, and there's such a taboo with that in the culture.
And actually Wanda Lust was murdered. It was the Alamo, the big theater downtown in Power and Light. It used to be years ago in the 70s was the Empire, and it was a traditional theater, and she was there, not in drag, visiting, or not visiting, but watching a movie, and apparently there were some people making noise in the movie, and he yelled at them, and after the movie, she was stabbed.
Wow.
Yeah.
So there wasn't any connection with the way that she identified?
Her work or her identity or anything like that. No. It was just be quiet while I'm trying to watch the movie.
Right, yeah. Which is
So shall we look at things?
Yeah.
All right, let's start over here. So I just pulled a random sampling of stuff to give you a sense of the scale and the variety of material that's here. And scale in terms of chronology.
So is this like in a timeline?
A little bit. It's a little bit chronological, but then there's other kinds of things. So we have a lot of stuff related to the practice of female impersonation, performative female impersonation. And that's a particular research interest of mine. And so I probably always pull too much about it because I find it really, really fascinating because it's so old. So this is a newspaper from 1925. The Kansas City Journal-Post. It was a competitor to the Times and Star, the Star. Okay. And at that point in time, vaudeville was still very popular, and vaudeville had about 135 performers who performed regularly as female impersonators. Wow. And they toured the country in circuit theaters. Yeah. We had a couple of those circuit theaters here in town.
So it's not something that was taking place in a bar?
No, this was legit theater. Yeah.
Wow.
And typically, the female impersonators performed at the Orpheum, which was down at 14th Baltimore, which was the Coffin Center of its day. It was a really, really nice theater. Nice. And this is...
So it's like respectable. I mean...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and kind of unexpected.
Yeah, for that time period.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so this is coverage of a performance by Carol Norman, who billed herself as the Creole fashion plate. She was a female impersonator, sang her own songs. They all sing their own songs. And like I said, this is coverage in the mainstream newspaper of this female impersonator in 1925.
I like that. Clothes make him the woman.
Yeah. And how this little piece talks about how he didn't know anything about his gowns. His mother made or purchased his gowns. And he was popular enough that he appeared on the cover of a number of different pieces of sheet music. This is a song that he would typically sing. So
it wasn't like now with mostly lip syncing, like these individuals sung.
All these people sang their own songs or did their own comedy routines. There's another. We have a recording, and I just listened to it again for just because of a contemporary of Carol Norman. His name was Bert Savoy, and we have a recording of him from 1923. You had the straight man, so to speak, in the act, Jay Brennan and Bert Savoy, and so the act consisted of them sort of talking.
Yeah.
And Bert Savoy would tell jokes and stuff. And I told you I could talk for far too much about this kind of stuff.
No, it's great.
Savoy was much more along the lines of a drag queen that we think of today.
Okay.
A really, really an exaggerated woman, right?
Yes.
Carol Norman and other performers, their deal was the illusion of being able to pass as a woman in looks, in attire, in stance, everything.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a boy. It's a really interesting character in that sort of transition to what we think of as female person.
So is that an audio recording or is it a
Yeah.
video?
It's an album.
Oh, okay, so there's a, yeah. There were
It's
no
a-
videos then.
Right. It's a 78.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really, to my knowledge, it's the only recording of a female person from Broadway.
That's incredible. I mean, that history is maintained.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's
Yeah.
still here.
So jumping ahead 40 years, this was in that video that you saw
Mhm.
of the walkthrough. But I still pull it because I think it's really, really cool. So this is an homage to Skip Arnold. And Skip Arnold was a performer at the Jewel Box and at the Colony, which were two bars over on Troost in the 3200 and 3300 block of Troost in the early and mid 60s. And Skip was very tall. Skip was 6'3" without heels. So when you see him in group photos, he's always in the back
Wow.
because you throw that into heels and
Yes.
top it with a wig. It's a big giant drag queen. So a guy named Horace Holmes, this man, made this in honor of Skip. And these were the three primary bars at the time: the Colony, the Jewel Box, and the Redhead, which was, you know where the Riot Room is in Westport?
Yes.
That was the Redhead. It was a gay bar
Nice. Wow.
way back in the 60s. So Skip performed at the Jewel Box. And many people know of the Jewel Box because it was nationally known on the drag circuit and in entertainment circles.
Mhm.
And the Jewel Box really was a straight club that featured drag. Many people I talked to, oh yeah, my grandparents went to the Jewel Box all the time. Yeah. But it was,
It's like going, like, they go to Hamburger Mary's now. Like, yeah.
I was visiting with a scholar who's working on a book on gay bars, and his take is Jewel Box and Hamburger and places like Hamburger Mary, gay bars for certain people.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's an interesting take. But
Yeah,
anyway,
they get acclimated or can see someone
Yes.
in like a safe space. For
Exactly.
Them. Yeah.
So these are some of the performers at the Jewel Box. And like I said, originally it was at 3219 Troost. In 1972, it moved over to 31st and Main. You know where the Wendy's is at 31st and Main?
Mm-hmm.
That's where the second Jewel Box was.
Oh. So there were multiple. That's cool.
Yeah. And the guy who owned it eventually, over on Troost, opened up a couple of other clubs. The Yum Yum Club was a strip club. And then when he moved over to 3110 Main, he also opened another strip club called the Pete Garter Strip-O-Rama. And Pete Garter had the best neon sign. It was purple with pink neon.
Ooh, yes.
It was the coolest sign. So representative of 50s and 60s,
Yeah.
female impersonation, Kansas City, 70s and 80s. This is a photo album from Dudley Marriott, friend Melinda Ryder, if you know Melinda Ryder.
Yes.
And these are performances in the mid to late 70s at the Cabaret, which was down at 1014 Oak. And these are some competitions that were there. And I want to, since you know Melinda Ryder.
Is Melinda in here?
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
As a baby.
Look at her.
Embryonic Melinda Ryder. But they were good friends, and that's how we got the photo album.
Yes.
Because Dudley passed, and he, Bruce and Kirk had the photo album. So anyway, with this one, this is Myrna Vaughn. Myrna Vaughn performed back in my day, in the late 80s. This is performances at, oh my God, Bar, The Edge, down on 8th and Broadway. Again, another friend of Melinda, involved, very active. Everybody knew who Myrna Vaughn was, active in the pageant circuit, all that kind of stuff. And then as drag becomes mainstreamed, We have examples of that phenomenon happening. These are some posters. We have a lot more stuff related to the early days of late night theater.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Yeah.
Which had a resurgence. Yeah.
Yes. David Wayne Reed, who was in the original iteration of late night theater, gave us his collection. It's got photographs and scripts and all sorts of stuff, and promotional material like these very cool silkscreen posters. So, turning to different other types of material, we have lots and lots of publications, as you can imagine, in the collection. Both going back to '79, that's splendid.
Oh my gosh, that's so great.
A lot of the earlier publications, especially pre-1975, are from advocacy groups, they're newsletters.
Okay, yeah. I mean, you had to get this is before the internet. You had to get the word out in some way.
Yeah. This is, and this was it. This was it, and quite honestly, jumping a little bit ahead in time, that was because I moved here in '85, and that was these kinds of publications was where you got the latest information on the development of AIDS. HIV/AIDS.
Wow, yeah. Because nobody else was talking about it, but you could trust these publications.
There were 3 news channels. There were 3 channels, period, on your TV, and they weren't covering the detail that people wanted and needed. It wasn't being covered in mainstream print publications like the Star. And so a magazine called The Alternate News, which I don't have out here, was the source. And it's interesting to look at the issues as time goes on, from like '82 on. Just to see how much of the content of the alternate news is taken up by developments in HIV/AIDS, whether it's political or medical or whatever.
Yeah.
So, for me personally, that's why I would go. Well, that's not the only reason I would go out every weekend, but it was also to pick up the alternate news on Friday to see what was going on. Yeah.
And that covered, what was happening in the community, but also
but also nationally. It's like the drug trials and
that's groundbreaking information.
Yeah. Again, there was no place else to get it.
Yeah.
And they were free. There was an alternative bookstore that sold things like the New York Native, but as a kid who had no money,
how were you going to do that?
Yeah. And so this is very interesting. As I was pulling this stuff, I just put these together this morning. These are physique magazines, which were published in the 60s. Sort of precursors to full-blown porn.
Yeah.
Sold ostensibly as physical fitness, right?
Oh, yes.
And so all the boys have straps on, because otherwise, you couldn't mail it. And these were extremely popular. As you can imagine, these were extremely popular.
What's the closest thing you could get to having some form of pornographic material?
Exactly. And this is a physique magazine that was published in Kansas City.
Wow.
Troy Saxon Studio published, I think there were 2 that were published, and so he would hire these boys, and in many cases just make up these background stories about, he's a baseball player at KU or whatever.
What year is this?
This is 60, that's a good question. This is 63, 64.
Sort of creating that anonymity for them too, so that nobody,
Yeah. It's very interesting. I have a friend who was one of the co-founders of GLAMA who's gone on to do his own research, and he has tracked down almost every model.
Wow.
In this, and I think there's a second gallery that was published here. He's writing a book about just where these guys ended up. Some of them are willing to talk. Most of them won't talk to him.
Yeah.
That's
part of stigma. It's
right. Can I get their names? I bet I can get them to talk to me.
And it's just, it's just interesting as I'm pulling contemporary stuff. This is relatively contemporary. This is 2000 and 2007. Just how little changes over time.
It's just bigger, bolder.
Right, and more upfront.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is a scrapbook. This is a photo scrapbook from a woman named Evie Akers, and she was one of the founders of what was called the Kansas City Co-ed Sports League. And it was just that. It was a league of different kinds of amateur sports that was started in the community as an alternative to bars for people to do stuff, to get together.
And now we have that I always feel like that's continued on with, we have Stonewall Sports, we have the American Softball League here.
Right,
yeah.
right. And the Heart American Softball League actually started as part of this.
Wow.
Because these guys offered bowling, softball, darts, and horseshoes.
Oh, we have a whole darts team here too.
Yeah.
I can't remember what it's called.
Yeah.
Horseshoes.
Horseshoes, yes. And so this is just a photo album of the various activities of the teams that made up the league. We actually have some film footage as well of them bowling. And the Mission Bowl over in Mission.
Yes, they still have events there.
Was the place where all the activity took place. They were very, very community friendly.
That is so cool.
And that's where most of these pictures are from. This is Eddie.
A lot of people forget where they're rooted in, where it comes from.
Yeah. When we started GLAMA, we were afraid that we were going to have trouble getting stuff from lesbians. Because it was 3 white guys who were sort of going out in the community and promoting this thing. And as it turns out, that hasn't been the case. The collections now are probably 55% men or men organizations and 45% women or women's organizations.
Wow.
Yeah, and this is a good example. So there was a woman named Barbara Greer, and she lived here. Her family eventually settled here in Kansas City, Kansas. And by the mid-1950s, when she was a young woman, she got connected to the first national lesbian advocacy organization called the Daughters of Belitas. They started in 1955 in San Francisco. And Barbara Greer was a rabid bibliophile. She loved lesbian books. It was her mission to get a copy of every single lesbian book ever and save it and preserve it. Yeah, she was really kind of manic about it. And so she connected with the Daughters of Belitas, and she started to write a column for their newsletter. The newsletter was called The Ladder, and it was distributed to membership. There was membership across the country, always very small, like maybe a few hundred people. But the newsletter got passed around, right?
Yeah.
So somebody gets in the mail, and there's evidence of ladder parties where a big group of lesbians would come together and read the ladder out loud together.
Oh my gosh.
And so Greer wrote these columns about books. She would do book reviews, she would do book lists and all that kind of stuff. Eventually she became the editor-in-chief of The Ladder by the end of the 60s. And when it folded in the very early 1970s, she and her partner at the time, Donna McBride, were living in Kansas. And Greer's doing all this while she's based in Kansas City.
Wow.
Very interestingly, during the 60s, she was partners with a woman named Helen Bennett. Helen Bennett had my job. Helen Bennett was the curator of the rare books collection for the university. I know, it was really, really weird when I learned that. But anyway, Barbara Greer and Donna McBride start, once the ladder folds, they start this press called Naiad Press. And it was the first press that was devoted to exclusively publishing lesbian literature. And it starts in suburban Kansas City.
Wow.
And a few years ago, we got the complete output of the press, all the books that they published, because they had already given their personal collection to San Francisco Public Library.
Okay.
So they gave us all the books, and when we got them, I started going through them, and they had these flyers in the books. So we got this nice supplement to the book collection.
Yes.
So this is their catalog, if you can imagine. And this is from 77. And so they 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 books that they offered.
I mean, it's not like there were a lot of books available.
Right. It's just these 2 women doing this.
Yes.
Right? And so this is the catalog by 1990.
Wow.
Yeah.
Definitely grown. Yeah.
By that point, they've moved to Tallahassee. And obviously they've grown.
And you could order your book, I guess?
Yeah.
Yeah, nice.
Yes. So Greer's a really interesting woman. She was a Spitfire. was just really, really fascinating.
It's not like you could go to your local public library
Right.
and pick up those books.
Right.
Yeah. Like, that's
Maybe
not
by
an
the
option.
90s you could. In 1973, there were 2 student groups that formed in the University of Missouri, one on this campus and one in Columbia. And they tried to get official recognition from the administrators on both campuses to get the money that comes with official recognition to do programming, right?
Yeah.
And the school turned them down repeatedly. And so they sued the school. And the case went all the way to the Supreme Court.
Wow.
And so the first case, there were 3 different suits. There were 3 different trials. The first one was decided in favor of the school. The second one was decided in favor of the students. And then the school took it to the Supreme Court because they wouldn't let it go.
Yeah.
The Columbia administrators.
Well, yeah. I mean, they want to silence that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And their argument was, you all are promoting illegal activity, which technically is right.
Yeah. At
that time.
Mm-hmm.
But the Supreme Court decided not to hear the case. And so the lower court ruling stood, the one in favor of the students. And so this is the school newspaper from the fall of that year, 1978. It took 5 years. And that's the announcement of the Gay Student Union.
Yeah, and it's a diverse group of individuals there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Aaliyah's still around. She's a big supporter. Was performing. And Melinda was called Cabaret. It was downtown 1014 Oak. It was actually 3 different bars. There was a piano bar, the main dance bar, and then Sappho's, which was a lesbian bar down in the basement of the Cabaret. And this is just a flyer from...
Yeah, I've heard of the Cabaret numerous times, but not...
That's an older version of the Cabaret.
Oh, okay.
This one is. We've got some stuff from the version that I think you've heard of.
Yes.
Lots of stuff around Pride festivals. This just happens to be a poster from 1982. Obviously, that's Liberty Memorial. While we have lots of stuff around Pride festivals, it's very interesting that we have very little. This is about the only thing we have from the early 80s.
Mm-hmm.
It's so weird. It's an interesting gap that either people didn't save it or there wasn't much produced around the Pride festivals of the early 1980s. But fortunately, we have this.
The early 1980s also was like the beginning of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, where lots of people were dying quickly.
Right.
Our government wasn't really doing a whole lot.
Believe me, I was there. So yeah, I was here.
Huge gap.
Yeah. To that end, so these are images of bars from 1987, and they were used by a group you may have heard of them called the Condom Crusaders.
I love that name.
Yes.
Yeah.
So obviously, you guys are aware that in the early days of HIV/AIDS, not only was it a health crisis, but it was a behavior modification project.
Mm-hmm.
You had to teach people, you had to convince people to wear condoms, and you had to teach them how to wear them right and why you needed to wear them.
Yes.
And so the Condom Crusaders would do just that. They would go out to bars and on Friday and Saturday nights, and they would just stand there and hand out condoms and explain why you needed to wear them and just give them the whole spiel. And so these are slides. So they would do other sort of more formal education projects, and these are slides from those projects of the bars that they would visit.
Oh my goodness!
So this is interesting. This is the east end of what's now Costco Home Depot, and this is the west end of what's now Costco Home Depot.
Oh wow!
So Arabian Nights is the whole bar. So you know where Gillum sort of curves?
Mm-hmm.
That's where the Arabian Nights was. The tent, as people called it. Kontiki here. So this is Linwood right down here, and this is Maine.
Okay.
So the McDonald's that's there now is sort of right in there. This was the old McDonald's, but the Kontiki was right here, and it was a leather denim bar, sort of neighborhood bar.
Yeah.
This is what I think you know as the Cabaret at 51st and Main. This is this is across from what's now CBS. And during this period, there was a brief period where it was known as Pegasus, or known on the street as Peggy Sue's. But this is where the bar was, and just literally down the street. So there was Peggy Sue's, there was Andre's, and then Billie Jean's. because this is Perfect Sense, or whatever that little Sense store is, that card store. Anyway, Billie Jean's was a lesbian bar. So you had Peggy Sue. During this same period, though, there were a couple of other clubs down in what's now the Crossroads. Taps was at 19th and Main, and Taps was another sort of leathery identity bar. And then up the road was the Windjammer, which was definitely a leather bar.
I love all these names.
I was just thinking, I was like, Windjammer, what a fun name for a bar. And I like how people, we create our own names too for the bars. So like Peggy Sue,
Messy Bees.
Yeah, right?
I've never heard that. That's good.
It is when it closes, that's for
sure.
So as you can imagine, we have a lot of material related to the early days of the HIV/AIDS crisis. And this is a good example. This is from a man named Art Brad. And he was an activist. He was a longtime activist. He just passed I guess it's been several years ago now. He was a very sweet man and really, really funny. But he started clipping the newspapers in 1985. And most of his early clippings were exclusively focused on the AIDS crisis. And as coverage in both the paper and national press expanded to include a broader range of LGBT topics, he would clip on those as well.
Oh, no.
But it's just as you said, there was no internet, right?
Yeah, so this was your resource.
So this was the resource, yeah. And it's a wide range of stuff. So here's an article from Time Magazine, Newsweek. So he would clip letters, he would, stuff about events, benefits, he would keep selections. This is that alternate news magazine that I was telling you about, that bar rag. And as he traveled, he would gather stuff. It's an amazing record, and there are 14 boxes of these. Wow! So he clipped until the day he died. Yeah. He died in 2014, and when he passed, the folks who were cleaning up the house called me up and said, "Got something for you," and it was a folder of clippings.
Oh my God!
He was still clipping. He fell off a ladder and literally died.
Yeah.
You forget. You just, forget the details of how long things were.
Yeah.
I just read a book. I just finished a book. I don't know if you know the story of this woman in Arkansas named Drew Coker. She's got a married name. I don't know what the married name is. She connected. She was in Hot Springs, and she connected with people who were afflicted with AIDS at that point, and their parents, their families wouldn't want the bodies when they pass, and so she buried them. She buried their remains in her family cemetery. And she became this huge advocate and did all this work.
Yeah,
and became known as this person who would do this in this really, really, really hateful part of the world. And in the very early of Springfield, which is very similar to Hot Springs, and I just how really ugly things were. And her book that's the best thing about the book, is just the accurate rendering of what it was like in small, ruralish cities.
And the work that she did, she put herself out there.
Yeah, she did. It's really kind of amazing. It's the second gay and lesbian march on Washington. There was another one in '79 following the Anita Bryant stuff, the murder of Harvey Milk. These things tend to occur after a crisis, right?
Yes.
And so this is of course in the middle of the worst part of the AIDS epidemic. This is after the Supreme Court decision that upholds the legality of anti-sodomy laws. It was just a really brutal time, and so there's about 1 million people that gather. There are estimates of 500 to 800,000, and people come back to their home cities fired up, because it's a really powerful thing to see 799,000 other people, right?
Right.
And so that's, at least in Kansas City, that's when you start to see the formation of activist groups, which eventually leads ACT UP gets started. The Triangle Political Coalition gets started, which is a precursor to promo. And ultimately here, that's what leads to the passage of the non-discrimination ordinance. We have a documentary on our website called The Ordinance Project.
I'm Austin Williams. I'm a doctoral student here at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. I'm in the Gay and Lesbian Archive of Mid-America right now, where for the last year and a half, I've been pouring through documents, primary sources, videotapes. I've found a story about an ordinance that took place in Kansas City, Missouri in 1990 that I know has to be told. So why does a film need to be made about this ordinance? Well, ordinance number 65430 was, and I'm pretty sure to this day, the most contested piece of legislation in Kansas City history. You had thousands of people call the phone lines and literally shut down the phone lines in City Hall. You had over a dozen hours of testimony take place over a period of 3 weeks that were so intense, that were so highly divisive, that it's amazing that more people don't know this story. The second reason that I think it's important to tell this is because Kansas City, to my knowledge, is the only city that ever tried to pass a civil rights ordinance that not only protected people with AIDS, but also based on sexual orientation at the same time. The third reason that this is important is that if you want to understand that era of AIDS at its peak, when there wasn't medication, that people were dying, but at the same time fighting for just basic civil rights, where the mere rumor of being gay, not just being openly gay or lesbian, but just the mere rumor that you were homosexual could get you fired, then these two issues were so inseparable. By studying this ordinance, you get a better sense of how you could not talk about one without talking about the other. And why was it so highly divisive? Well, the fourth reason, and maybe one of the more interesting reasons to study this ordinance, is that it tells you about the modern conservative movement. If you want to understand transgendered bathrooms and an upheaval about gays and lesbians and the Boy Scouts, well, then you got to go back and look at this ordinance from 1990.
You are not asking for special privileges.
For the last year and a half, I've been meeting with city council members. You've got activists, community organizers, the opponents, the supporters, and all of them not only are willing to tell their story, they want to tell their story. There are so many amazing things that I can't believe that people have shared with me and that I want to share with you. So we've got all this footage, but what I need your help with is making sure that we still talk to more people so that their stories get interwoven into this documentary.
As we move closer to where we are now, because the stuff that's being produced now will be historical 15, 20, 40, 50 years from now, right? Yeah. So it's our job to save the contemporary in advance of it becoming historical. Mm-hmm. So this was the marriage amendment in Missouri.
Yes.
That defined marriages between a woman and a man. Of course, Julie Justice has run for state senate. This came from Sharice's mom. She's an alum of the school.
Aww.
And I had met her. I'd given a class presentation. I'd met her. This is well before Sharice ran, and then when she ran and won, she called me up and said, "Would you be interested in some campaign material?" Yeah, we definitely would. And then this is one that was signed by Sharice. So I mentioned, representation of lesbians in the collection. Mm-hmm. Where we have some more gaps are from people of color, and we have a little bit from the trans community, but not as much as I would like to see.
Okay. So it's definitely a call for that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's just a matter of connecting with those communities, right? Mm-hmm. Right now, GLAMA is pretty much me, and so it's just been a real challenge to make those connections, but I think we'll get there eventually. The ultimate goal, if I can work through the school, is to set up a community advisory board. I've seen other archives like this do that.
Yeah.
To great success. St. Louis has 70 people on their community advisory board. So I think we would get some real interest, and that's how you engage with communities who may be less forthcoming with their trust.
Like, what are you doing with that material? Is it really archived?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. That relates to the trans community. These are really, really interesting and really rare. Nationally distributed magazines from the early 90s.
Wow.
Yeah. And then this hasn't been processed yet. This is a recent gift from the estate of Joe Louis Maddox, who was a historian and Kansas City historian. And this is correspondence. He was gay. And these are letters and postcards and other correspondence between him and his friends and some lovers. He was stationed in Germany during the Vietnam War in the 60s.
Yes.
And had developed some strong relationships with some men. And I had forgotten about this, frankly, and I'm really, really excited to get this process because I think it'll be really, really fascinating.
Yeah, it shows that we've always been here.
Yes. Because when I was first thinking about GLAMA, when I graduated from library school in 1994, at that point, lots of people were still dying. And my concern was what was happening to their letters and their photographs, right? Yeah. Because at that point, you wrote letters to people.
You didn't text.
And it's been really interesting as the archive has evolved and matured to not see very much of this kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's mostly been what we've looked at, but very little personal correspondence and personal kinds of stuff.
This was the human side of it.
Yeah. So I'm thrilled about this collection for multiple reasons. But anyway, and then this last chunk of stuff it's pulled together because it's things you might not think would appear in an archive, right?
Yeah, how do you decide what goes in and what doesn't?
Yes. I tend to err on keeping too much because I don't know what will be of interest 50 years from now, right? But we are blessed with the fact that we have a sound archive in our library. It's 400,000 sound recordings.
Wow.
Of every stripe in terms of format and the machines that will play them and in terms of content.
Yeah.
And so when people have records to give us, we can take them because we're set up to take them. And these are just 3 examples. So Lesbian Concentrate, this is another example of like Naiad Press, Olivia Records was a woman-based company.
Wow.
And this
just promote
that did everything. That that performed the songs, women, that signed the artists, that did the production, the distribution, everything.
And that's because there wasn't a market outside of that. Like they couldn't go to Sony Records or something.
Right, Capitol Records or something like that. Yeah, there just wasn't the interest on mainstream labels, And so this is in response to Anita Bryant. Have you heard of Anita Bryant? So Anita Bryant was the spokeswoman for Florida Orange Juice. And totally rabidly anti-gay.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, pipe on their face, right?
Yes.
Yes. And so...
They should have threw oranges. That would have been great.
You should Google some of her orange juice commercials. They're really, really freaky. There's this little cartoon bird that comes and she sings to it, and it's really weird. But...
She's dead now.
So Lesbian Concentrate refers to the orange juice. And these are all songs refuting Anita.
I like that lesbians for OJ.
Ray Bourbon was a well-known female impersonator. He performed in Kansas City during the 1930s and came back and ended his career in Kansas City in the 1960s at the Jewel Box. And this is a recording of a show he did at the Jewel Box from 1964, I believe.
Wow.
Yeah.
Elderly delinquents.
It's very vaudevillian shtick, kind of crude, raunchy, very
the foundation for drag. Yeah.
Very bawdy. And then Billy Tipton. Do you know the story of Billy Tipton?
No.
Billy Tipton's really, really interesting. Billy Tipton presented as female as a young person. Went to high school here in Kansas City at Southwest. And was a musician and relocated down in southeast Kansas, southwest Missouri, northeast Arkansas, or northeast Oklahoma area.
Okay.
Mostly Kansas, southeast and south central Kansas, and couldn't get work. This is like the 1930s. Couldn't get work until I don't know what pronouns he used, but when he started presenting as male, that's when he got work. And so he did that as a very young man, as a very young person, and then spent the rest of his life presenting as male. And he was married to two women. With the second woman, they adopted 2 kids. The family never knew until he passed. He ended up in the Pacific Northwest, was living with his son, and would never go see a doctor because that would reveal
what was going on.
What was going on. And so it was a stomach thing. I think it was, I don't know what it was specifically, but when the EMTs came and started to work on the body, that's when the son learned.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting story.
Wow.
Yeah, lots of buttons. Back in the day, instead of giving something a thumbs up, you actually wore it on your person, the things that you supported.
Yes.
So that's what these are. Have lots and lots of people say lots and lots of buttons. Little knick-knacky things. Valentine video. I mean, this is from my day. This is actually came from me. Valentine Video was a gay-friendly, gay-owned video store back in the day, back in the late 80s. And they had a huge collection of porn. And so it was a very active and very, you would run into people there all the time.
Cruising spot.
Yeah.
It was a cruising spot.
It was originally at 37th and Southwest Traffic Way. It's the name. It was in the Valentine neighborhood. Then it moved down into Westport. And I just came across this today in the process collection. I'd never seen this. So this is from, obviously, Cabaret down on Oak. And while it seems like a goofy thing to have, right?
Mm-hmm.
And thinking about it, it's like, well, this is kind of a safety thing. Because if you're leaving a gay bar at 1 o'clock in the morning in downtown Kansas City at 10th and Oak, and you encounter some difficulty, you might want to blow your whistle to call for help.
Wow.
I know.
Wow.
Yeah. These, students can't believe we have these. These are from the Condom Crusaders. These are some of the condoms that they would hand out.
Oh my gosh.
In 1991.
Yes.
But students just are blown away by the fact that we have condoms in the archive. But one of the guys who was affiliated with the oversight group of Condom Crusaders actually saved all this stuff.
Now I hand out condoms, so I'm not surprised by that. But I can see for like straight individuals, the fact that we hand condoms out at the bar is like shocking to them.
Yeah.
Because you don't see that in a heteronormative bar.
Right.
It's only in queer bars where you see like condoms being distributed.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you should come back and look at the Condom Crusaders manual, and I think that's a t-shirt.
I like some of these marketing ideas.
Yes, absolutely.
A ring for your next engagement. Exactly. I love that.
Stop transmission fluid leaks. I like that one.
Yes. Dress for success. I mean, these are really good.
Yeah. These come from Nancy Thomas, and they are club cards. You had to have a card to get into a bar.
Oh, I used to have a card to get into Missy B's.
Same exact principle. And these were some of these are some of the bars.
Why did we do away with that?
I don't know. I'm about to find it. I'm sure it's in an old wallet.
You should give it to the archive.
Yes,
absolutely.
That is so cool.
Yes, and then matchbooks, of course. The jewel box, because it was so successful, they generated a lot of promotional stuff, and they had 5 different matchbook covers. This kind of thing. The Cabaret. I thought we had one of the Windjammer. We had one of the Windjammer. Where it is the Open Range, which was up next to Sidekicks. Yes, Open Range was right next to Sidekicks.
Buddies?
Open Sore.
Yeah.
But,
Open Sore.
Wow. Savage.
Yeah, like boogies.
Boogers?
Yeah.
So yeah, just things that you wouldn't necessarily expect to find in an archive.
Wow. I think to answer your question, what these were used for, like the Missy B's card, because I remember having to wait and to ask for it, and going and talking to one of the bar managers about like, can I get a card? Because you didn't have to pay a cover if you had your Missy B's card.
Didn't have to pay a cover.
I've never had to pay cover, and I've never
I haven't either.
And I've never had a card though. I just walk in.
I had just moved here. I needed a card.
Oh.
Didn't have to pay cover. Didn't have to show your ID.
I just ran in the right circles, I guess.
Exactly.
Or the wrong ones.
Right?
Ooh.
You're in the back entrance, it's fine.
She's a mess, let her in.
Tracks was where the levee is. Okay.
Oh.
Yeah.
And
I love the levee. I almost went last night.
it was mid 80s, about 87, 80. It was a new thing. It was a video bar.
Ooh,
So they had cameras everywhere, or monitors everywhere. And on Wednesday nights, they had Dynasty Night.
Gay.
Oh my gosh, yeah, you totally had to be there.
Shoulder to shoulder. It was packed.
It's like RuPaul now.
Yeah.
And so over the commercials, they would play music. And chatter.
Mm-hmm.
Literally, the instant the show came back on, the music stopped and it became quiet as a church. It was hilarious.
RuPaul.
Just like, yeah. Are the pose watch parties, I mean, some of the like